Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on pandemic bioethics at the 2020 Summer Research Institute of St. Thomas University in collaboration with Miami-Dade College in Miami, Florida. The epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic for the world, how's that for a claim to infamy, will be on the map for sure. I always like to begin my sessions with a little prayer. So I ask you a moment to gather our thoughts and ask the good Lord to be with us. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you. In the midst of the trials and difficulties of life, as you well know much better than us right now, Lord, for ourselves, personally, and for the whole world. We want to thank you also for your many blessings, for the gift of life, for the fact that we woke up this morning and are here today, and for the capacity that you give us for reasoning, for willing the good and doing the good, for allowing us to learn, to study, and to research so that we may know the truth, because we know, Lord, that it is only the truth that sets us free. And as we move forward in the midst of this global coronavirus infection epidemic, we ask your guidance to always do what is right and to help others in the process as we ourselves learn and become educated on the matter, that we may also teach others how to stay safe and hopefully in due time overcome this pandemic. We pray in a special way today for those who are in most need of your divine mercy in our families, our friends, locally, and throughout the whole world. This we ask in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. My name is Cioffi, and I am a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Miami for over 35 years now. And just very briefly, academically, as far as my academic competence, I have a doctorate in moral theology from the Gregorian University in Rome, Italy. I also have a doctorate in genetics from Purdue University. And the way that came around is because I have a background in biology before going into the priesthood. Back in the 70s, I came to Miami to study marine biology, and then eventually discerned a vocation to the priesthood and thought that at that point, biology would be a hobby for me, because what does a priest do with biology, right? Well, then the bioethical issues started coming up, like human cloning, for example, and stem cell research and all this. So the long and the short is that I have gone for further studies, not once, but twice, to earn terminal degrees, one in moral theology and the other one in genetics, so that it gives me the competence to talk about these issues, both on the scientific level and on the theological/philosophical level, which is where is the intersection of bioethics, okay? So I have been teaching at St. Thomas University now for over a dozen years, probably closer to 15 years. And I teach biology and bioethics there. Okay. I also want to apologize from the very start, because I'm in my 60s. And I want to apologize especially to the young people of today, to our students and those who are researching with us, and also on behalf of my generation, because when I was in my teens and my 20s, I had a very carefree life. As I mentioned, came here to Miami to study marine biology, went into FIU at the time. Well, first Miami-Dade College, junior college. It was only a 2-year institution. MDC only had 2 campuses, the North Campus and the South Campus, which is now the Kendall Campus. And after a year and a half at MDC, I went to FIU in '72 when FIU started. It was one building, the whole university, and a second building was being built. PC, Primera Casa, was the first building, and DM, Deuxième Maison, was the second building. And the whole university was in this one 5-story building, PC, which is still standing today. It is the administrative building today. Everything was there. We were about 5,000 students back then, and DM was the science building, the second one to be built. All the buildings were being named in a sequence like that, numbers, in different nationalities, different languages, because it was Florida International University, okay? So just to highlight my carefree life back then, my late teens, my early 20s, I used to live in Sweetwater, which is across the street from 8th Street over here. This used to be an airport. It was the old Tamiami Airport, Tamiami Trail, otherwise known as 8th Street, Southwest Miami. I would get on my bicycle, go across from Sweetwater through the fields here, through the grass. I remember seeing lizards, snakes crawling around, and my lifestyle back then was basically scuba diving in the morning, sailing in the afternoon, and partying at night, okay? Absolutely carefree, just wonderful, young life. The whole world was ahead of me and in front of me, just to be taken by storm, as they say. Today, FIU is a huge campus. This is the main building, not they have another site, Interama building by a site by the Intracoastal Waterway in northeast Miami. The campus holds now more than 50,000 students, all right? And it has grown tremendously in 50 years, basically, just under 50 years. But this is how it all started. At any rate, I want to apologize because now for the youth and for all of us, we no longer have that carefree life. As soon as we step out of the door of our homes, we have to put on masks and maintain physical distancing with other human beings. And this is the world, essentially, that we older people are giving to you, youth, today. Okay? This is what we've made of it, because it wasn't the youth that got us into this pandemic, one way or another. And so it's very challenging and very humbling to see what is happening right now. And I'll say that last century, the contribution of the elderly to the world was 2 world wars in the first half of the century, which had to be put to a stop by dropping not 1, but 2 nuclear bombs on civilian population. And so the second half of last century was tremendously devoted to searching for peace. The coming together of the United Nations and many peace treaties throughout the world, to the point of continuing with nuclear research, but for peaceful purposes rather than warfare. And then we went into the Cold War with the Soviet Union until that collapsed, and so forth. But I don't want to belabor the point. What I'm trying to say by all this is that we as adults can mess it up. And we can mess it up royally, okay? And these are bioethical issues. These are bioethical issues because it involves life and human life. So I also want to say from the start that because, and especially because of the pandemic, now more than ever, you're going to have to own your education. Own your education. What I mean by this is that you're going to have to think critically, sometimes fast, sometimes you'll have the luxury of time, of thinking about it, of pondering, all right, and even researching it. But definitely you're going to have to own your education more than any other previous generation has done. There are a few examples in history that have done that. It is said that, for example, Abraham Lincoln was a self-made man. He taught himself law, and became a lawyer and became a president in the United States. Albert Einstein did the same. When he found his physics class and his math class boring in high school and in college, he spent his time in the library reading the latest research on physics and mathematics. And he built his own education, all right? Now, the challenge with this is that nature is economic. In other words, when something works in nature, nature doesn't fix it or change it. It leaves it alone. And so there's repetition. We see that the development of legs, for example, in evolution has worked for many, many animals of very different species, very different phyla, all right? And so if it works, nature leaves it alone and just makes more of it, because nature is constantly trying to conserve energy. Now that to the human translates, unfortunately, one aspect of nature is economic, is that the mind is lazy. We'd rather not think than think. In fact, it takes more ATPs to think. You who are scientists, you know, I'm talking about adenosine triphosphate. We have a large percentage of our circulatory system engages the brain, the head, all right? That's why the carotid arteries and the jugular veins are so important, because they supply the blood flow to the brain back and forth, from the heart, from the lungs, back to the lungs, etc. And that circulation is not only for nutrients, but also for oxygen. So the brain uses a disproportionately large amount of oxygen than the rest of the body. In fact, you can think of the body from the neck down as the support system for the brain, okay, for the activity of the brain. And that's also why we lose a lot of heat from the head. And us who are getting bald lose even more heat, because hair retains heat. It retains a veneer of air around our bodies that heats up, and air is a great insulator. Okay. At any rate, what I'm trying to say by all this is that the brain would rather save energy, ATPs, all right, which means not thinking. We have to make an effort to think. In fact, if we were to think for 1 hour, like study for 1 hour, a heavy subject like science or math, or we were to run for 1 hour, which is kind of a mindless exercise, even if it's the treadmill or a stationary bicycle, right? Kind of mindless. That's why people read books or watch movies while they're in this stationary exercise machines. So if we were to do physical exercise or mental exercise for 1 hour, we would use up about 2/3 more ATPs in the mental exercise, all right? And that's why what happens after an hour or two of studying, we start getting sleepy and our eyes start closing up, because we're exhausting the reserve of ATPs in our bodies, okay? But Professor, how come I don't lose weight when I study? Because you're eating into the active sugars, all right? You're eating into the glucose in the blood. You're not eating into the glycogen in your adipose tissue, in your fat layer. For that one, you need to get into the physical exercise, because that's what breaks down the muscle and rebuilds it, and that uses up the adipose tissue, okay? But we definitely use up more energy by thinking than by engaging in physical exercise. And so the mind would rather not do that. And that's why we need to force ourselves out of the complacency of not thinking, all right? I want to go a little bit deeper than that for a few minutes, because I also want to say that the mind, the brain, is essentially the organ that takes the longest to develop in the human body. If the reproductive system takes about 12 years to develop, right, from birth to puberty, the brain takes about 24 years to develop, really, twice as much, into the early 20s, okay? But that development is not linear, especially at the cerebral cortex, right? the cerebral cortex, which is where the thought process occurs, which is known as the gray matter. And what happens at the gray matter development is that first the baby is born with few synapses, and then in the young years of the preteen years, those synapses grow tremendously and connect and so forth. The neurons on the gray matter reach kind of a peak in the preteen years, all right, in the single-digit years. They reach a peak. And then into the teen years, we actually lose connections and lose neurons, right, in a process that is called synaptic pruning. You can look it up for more details, but basically you can see here on this research that was done in the Journal of Brain and Cognition, all right? Here is a scale of absolute value of 1 from 0 to 1, which can also be interpreted as a percentage scale. And you can see the gray matter, the blue range is down here. So this is maximal gray matter, will be more in the pink range, all right, in the early years. What happens is with age, into our 20s, into our early 20s, we actually lose gray matter down into the blue-violet region. That is a good thing, because when we have so many synaptic connections, the thought process cannot be complete. It's too fast, it's too extensive. The thought process has to go through too many channels to come up to conclusions. And so it's premature. So here's a case where more is less and less is more. More synapses are less thinking power, less power of discernment, of mature, responsible thinking. Fewer synapses into the teen years and into the early 20s allows us to think better, to do more rational, abstract thought, higher learning and thinking and analytics, okay? And so it's estimated that the human brain completes its development process between the 20 to 25 years of age. So around the average, let's say 22, 23 years, which 2 or 3 years more or less on either side of margin, okay? And who got this right? The insurance company, the car insurance, because when does the rate drop? The rate of car insurance drops at 25 years of age. So they're using the upper limit, the car insurance industry is using the upper limit of when the average human brain matures to make that decision to lower the insurance rate, because on average then from 25 forward, people are supposed to have fewer accidents, okay? And then the data corroborates that. So what I'm trying to say by all this is that teenagers and early adults don't really have a full brain in the functional sense of higher abstract thought, more mature thinking, okay? So there has to be an effort. There has to be an effort. This effort happened for me when I was at MDC, again, back in the 70s. It's one person waiting. Excuse me for a moment. See, I can see it here. Okay. Yes. So I was mentioning that I came to Miami in the 1970s, in 1970 actually, and started at MDC. Back then, I was taking a course. I was doing my general requirements and pre-biology, an associate in arts in pre-biology, yeah. And remember one of the introductory psychology courses, the professor did this diagram on the board, and it stuck with me. For 50 years, this diagram has stuck on my head. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a Napoleonic clock, all right? This is a Napoleonic clock. It's the model kind of mimics the Napoleonic hat, which I'm not gonna bother going into, but basically it looks like a Napoleonic clock, all right? But this clock only has one needle, all right? And it represents the mind. And he said to us, and he made this challenge to us back 50 years ago, when I was in my late teens. He says, your mind, you can have your mind on or on off. It's your choice. You choose where you want to have your mind, on or off. And I can tell you, in all honesty and humility, that at that point, when he said that, I decided in my mind, in my heart, I want my mind to be on, okay? And so I've been on the on mind for 50 years now, studying and researching and teaching and learning. I say the best teacher is a student, and the best student is a teacher. So we're always teaching and learning. One person, okay? So the best teacher is a student, and the best student is a teacher. We're always teaching and learning, all right? And we can make a lifetime out of it. And that's how I was able to obtain 2 doctorate degrees in 2 very prestigious universities that have, in principle, nothing to do with each other, and combine them into this emerging field of bioethics, which I'm going to talk about now. So you can see that bioethics is a compound word. Like many words, especially nouns, have 2 parts to them. And that's why I say it's an emerging field, because it is thoroughly interdisciplinary, and it combines 2 previous fields, 2 classical fields of study of the human endeavor that in principle have nothing to do with each other. Biology, which studies life, right? Biologos, the study or the speech of life, and ethics, which is one of the branches of philosophy, one of the 5 branches of philosophy, which studies human behavior, but typically in a more abstract way. However, bioethics puts the 2 together, and it's the ethics of life, including human life. So the ethics of nature, including human nature. One functional definition of bioethics is that what may be done out of what can be done in science and technology today. So you notice that the distinction between can and may is not just a grammatical distinction. It is an existential distinction. And it could mean, for some people, it can mean the difference between life and death. Because we can do many things in the lab today. We can do many, many things in the lab, in research. But may we do them? Should we do them? That's the key question. For example, cloning. We use cloning all the time in the lab. Bacterial cloning, other animals and plants. Many, many animals and plants have been cloned. But then enter Dolly, right? Dolly the sheep, back in the 1990s. And when Dolly got cloned, the first cloned mammal, I said, wow, this has huge bioethical implications, because we're mammals, biologically speaking, and the technique for cloning a sheep or cloning a human in the lab is identical. It is what is known as somatic cell nuclear transfer. I'm not going to get into it, but you can look it up. Somatic cell nuclear transfer, the same thing as cloning. It's a nuclear swap, all right? And so the technique is the same for a sheep, a cat, a dog, cattle, or a human. And in fact, human cloning was already attempted and published. You can look it up again. I'm not going to take too much time to go into it, but Hwang Woo-sok in 2005 and 2006 published not 1, but 2 articles in Science and in Nature, 2 of the most prestigious journals in the scientific community, claiming that he had achieved human cloning the first time, all right, in Korea, South Korea. Then it turns out that investigating further, some of the pictures look very similar to each other. And some investigators got into the actual data of Wusok and looking at his pictures, his photographs published, they noticed that they were copies, copy and paste, all right? And it turns out that his research was fraudulent. And so in 2006, these journals had to recant and rescind those, sorry, someone else coming in. I'm just now seeing these. So these two magazines, these two journals had to recant and rescind those articles because of fraudulent data and claims that were untrue. Bioethics, you see. And so now the scientific journals and all journals of the world have all kinds of review boards to make sure that the data is legitimate. And that's the world that you folks are coming into, adulthood. It's the world that we older adults have created because of a lack of ethics or a very defective ethics. All right? Now, our Lord Jesus said in the Gospel of Luke, "Do not judge and you will not be judged." But we judge all the time. From the moment I wake up, I'm judging what shoes I'm going to wear, what I'm going to have for breakfast, what clothing I'm going to wear, all right? So in what context does our Lord really mean, do not judge and you will not be judged? Because we have to judge, and we have to judge the moral action, also the ethical action. There's right from wrong. No, I just cannot go out in the street with a knife and start injuring people at random. It's not proper. I can do it, as long as I have a knife, I can do it. But should I do it? It's more than obvious and evident to anyone who is normal that I may not do that. I should not do that, even if it's not illegal, all right? Even if it's not illegal, I should not do that. There's an intuition that tells me I should not do that, all right? So what is it that we're judging? In the end, what we're judging is the human behavior, the action. We don't judge the conscience. We don't judge the conscience of the individual because no one has access to the conscience. No one knows what I'm thinking right now except myself and God. And so we cannot get into the conscience of other people, but we can certainly look at the actions and say that these actions objectively are wrong. And some of them should never be done, is what we call intrinsic evil, all right? We don't pass judgment on the conscience, again, of the person, because that conscience could be misinformed. But we certainly pass judgment on the actions and say some actions are right and some actions are wrong. All right, let me move forward since I brought in the topic of conscience. For a moment, look at this. Conscience is another one of these compound words, right? Which comes from the Latin, cum scientia, and literally it means with knowledge, with science, all right, with science. Those of you who have a Hispanic background or Romance languages like Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, or Romanian, which is also a Romance language, you can see that many of our words, especially the nouns, come from Latin, all right? And Latin comes from Greek, and that is the cultural birthplace of our Western civilization, is classical Greece, about 300 years before the time of Christ, with philosophy, with mathematics, with physics, astronomy, with literature, the arts, theater. Our cultural heritage of the Western world comes from classical Greece. Our agricultural heritage, which goes back several millennia, goes back to the Middle East, Mesopotamia, but culturally from classical Greece, which then was expanded throughout the whole Western world by the Roman Empire. Anyway, I'm getting off track. What I want to say is that we need to form our conscience, you see, because we're called to act in conscience. The conscience is the one that moves us to act rightly or wrongly. And so we have this responsibility to ourselves to learn and to inform our conscience. And once we do, then we can make rational decisions for good or for evil, all right? And so ultimately, bioethics is about human behavior, right or wrong human behavior. Again, we don't judge the conscience of the individual, but we encourage everyone to form their conscience in a proper way with true knowledge. And that's where we also need to discern the truth, right? And get at the truth as much as we can, precisely to inform our conscience and to make the proper decisions we need to make in this world, in this life, now more than ever. All right, let me move forward now and look at the issue at hand, which is the current pandemic of COVID. So just to be clear on the nomenclature, first of all, COVID-19 is an acronym or contraction for the disease itself. The actual virus that is causing the disease, for clarification, is called SARS-CoV-2, all right? SARS-CoV-2, which I'm going to be calling from now on the virus, because I'll refer to this many times, so this is the virus that I'm talking about. And again, just to be clear, SARS is an acronym for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. Severe as opposed to mild. So this could be life-threatening as opposed to a common cold, which normally is not life-threatening. Okay? Acute as opposed to chronic. Acute with a sudden occurrence and that can develop fast, as opposed to chronic, which is long-lasting and has been there in the background for some time. So all these two adjectives then raise a red flag for doctors, healthcare professionals, epidemiologists, anyone who is involved in the healthcare industry or system. The words severe and acute already raise two red flags. Respiratory, because this virus seems to attack mostly the lungs, but it can also attack the kidneys and other parts of the body, essentially the ones that have that ACE2 factor, the ACE2 receptor on the surface of the cells, as was talked about earlier in all the other talks and sessions that have been given. I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute. Finally, the syndrome. A syndrome, because this is the actual noun, right, on this phrase here, a syndrome is a cluster of signs and symptoms. Signs are internal to the patient, right? The patient may feel a stomach ache, but may not manifest anything outside. So there's no symptom of the stomach ache. Now, if the patient is vomiting, now we have a symptom. Okay, so signs are internal to the patient. The patient is detecting something wrong, the individual. The symptom is when that is manifested and is being measured, can be measured outside. For example, a fever, all right? The person feels hot, that's a sign. The symptom is they're running a fever, can be measured. So a cluster of signs and symptoms form a syndrome, many syndromes in healthcare for the human. And that is what SARS is. There's another one called MERS, which is the Middle East respiratory syndrome. And why two? Why two? Well, because it turns out that there was a one. There's already a SARS-CoV, which until this creature appeared on the scene last year, that was the only SARS-CoV, right? It was the fifth strain of coronaviruses. So we now have, that have been identified, 6 strains of the coronaviruses, okay? And of which one is a COVID-1, and so that's why this one is called COVID-2. So that's as far as the nomenclature, so that this is, again, part of that competence so that you people can speak with knowledge and also understand the information with knowledge. Now, this is informative. The fact that there were already 5 strains around of the coronavirus in the human population, all right? These are human coronavirus, aside from the bat coronaviruses and other mammalian coronaviruses. What I'm talking about is that there already, the human population had already been exposed to coronavirus over the years, over the decades, perhaps centuries, we don't know, because it wasn't documented back a few decades ago. But now we see, because the symptoms are flu-like, so these are retroviruses. Again, I'm not going to repeat too much information that's been given to you already. RNA viruses and influenza viruses in general are retroviruses, all right? And so these are influenza-like viruses, and therefore they have influenza-like symptoms, signs and symptoms. And many people thought that they had a flu virus instead of a coronavirus, or in fact they had a coronavirus, but the previous ones were mild, not severe, okay? Until the SARS viruses came on the scene. I also want to mention that this is not necessarily a bad thing, because we actually incorporate viruses and viral sequences into our genome, into our DNA. All right? It's estimated that 5 to 8% of our human genome is viruses or fragments of viral sequences. They're called HERVs, which stands for human endogenous retroviruses. Retro, again, a reference for the RNA viruses that necessarily need to make the DNA complement so that an mRNA can be made, et cetera, for transcription and translation. So these HERVs are embedded into our human genome, and they're not in the junk region, the 97% of the junk region of our DNA. They're in the coding region. All right, so they may have a purpose. We don't know. It's just being studied, but there's a lot of research that is going on into these HERVs, because some of them may have a predisposition for cancer, for example, but some may actually be beneficial. Most mutations we know are neutral, and also because many mutations actually fall in the non-coding region of our DNA, which is, again, 97% of the 3 billion base pairs, right? But keep in mind that over the eons, through human evolution, we have integrated viral sequences into our DNA, and it may actually be part of the immune system. That may actually stimulate our immune system into an immune response that is adequate for staying alive and surviving the previous 5 strains of coronaviruses that have infected humanity, especially in the East, in the Orient, in Asia, for decades, all right? And that's documented in the scientific literature. All right, for the rest, I'm not going to delve more too much into the biology of it. I want to refer you to all the previous sessions that have been done on this, the SRI, the Summer Research Institute going on at St. Thomas University by my colleagues, and have been published already in the classroom link that we have there. So you can just, in your email, you can punch in Alexis Classroom, which is a reference to Dr. Tapanes Castillo, who is the director of our 2020 SRI. And if you just put in these 2 keywords, you'll get all of the emails where it has the link to all of the talks, all of the previous talks and sessions that have been given on the basic biology, the genomics, the virology, the epidemiology of the virus, even drug development, vaccines, etc. All that is documented, so you can punch it in these 2 keywords on your email search, all right? Let me move forward. And if I miss and anyone sees, please, anyone else joining here, because I'm not always aware of this little screen on the side, let me know if there's anyone else waiting on the room to allow them in, all right? Thanks. Also, let me do this. Periodically, I will stop if you have any questions or comments, and we'll work it out this way. So you notice that the protocol, which I forgot to mention at the beginning of the session, is that you keep your mics muted. And your video is up to you. If you want to be seen, you can leave your video on, but be careful, because if you have your video inadvertently, we can see everything that you're doing and what's happening behind you also, all right? So you can also mute your camera if you want, or blank out the camera. At any rate, as protocol, we keep, for standard, we keep the mics muted, but if you have a question or a comment, like I'll stop every now and then, every new topic, for example, before the new topic. If you have questions and comments, open your mic, just state your first name briefly, pause for a second, If no one else is talking, go ahead and make your question or comment, all right? So this is one of those opportunities. I'm gonna stop here before going into herd immunity. Any questions or comments? Okay, I have a question for you because I'm never sure exactly what you're seeing. So when I present, I'm concerned that you will see the actual stuff that I have on the PowerPoint. And I'll be happy to share the PowerPoint also, aside from being recorded on the session, right? So you have it with you for reference, because I have a number of sites and links when I present. Well, this is still fairly large. We're gonna get now into things like this where I have small, typically the references are small, but they're embedded in there in the PowerPoint, so you can always go back to them and check them out. Again, any questions or comments? Otherwise, I'll keep moving forward. Okay, so herd immunity. Let's talk about herd immunity for a moment, because you've heard about herd immunity, and it's kind of a link to this, to the HERVs, in the sense that these sequences, these viral sequences, became embedded and integrated into our human genome eventually, and it's part of our protection system, one way or another, because we cannot live in a bubble, right? We have an immune system that is a natural immune system. There's a generalized immune system, then there's the specific, the native and specific immune system, and so forth. And this immune system is there to protect us from infections, which means that not only us, but all animals and plants are used to getting infected and overcoming those infections when the load is not too large. I'll talk about load further down in more detail, but basically we all achieve sooner or later a herd immunity for the population, especially for mammals. This is particularly true for mammals because we tend to be herdish, all right? And just because we humans don't think that we're too different from many herds of mammals that are out there, like zebra or flocks of birds also. For the warm-blooded, this is very true. That we are herdish. Consider, for example, large cities, metropolis, where we have millions of people living together. Well, that biologically can be considered essentially a herd, right? Because the people are interacting with each other on a regular basis and in fairly close contact with each other. Enough contact, enough proximity to infect each other if there were an outbreak of a novel virus. That's another word, novel. It's a new strain of the coronavirus, the 6th strain. And so it's novel, it's new. It means that we have not yet developed an immunity for it, all right? So that herd immunity is considered for the human approximately around 70%. Where does this 70% come from? I wanted to document that for you so that you understand, again, helping you to own, what I'm doing here is helping you to own your education and showing you how your education, you need to own your education. How to do this? Well, you just punch in herd immunity and you start reading up on it, all right? And then what you have to do is you have to sift, because when you Google something, what you're gonna get is, you're gonna get 3 things. Well, actually 4. You're going to get the good, the bad, the ugly, which was an Italian Western many years ago. And then you're also going to get the beautiful, right? So the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. And you have to search between all that, what is right and what is wrong, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And you try to corroborate the information. And sometimes you have to use lateral corroboration, which I'll get to later further down the slides. But basically, let's go back to herd immunity. You've heard it say that we would have to reach about 70%. What does that 70% mean? That 70% of the population, of the human population, would have had to be exposed to the virus and overcome the virus and survived, all right? Now, let's make it for simplicity's sake 100. 100 is that magic number of sample, the sample number, not because there's anything intrinsically good or important about 100 or magic. It's simply that 100, you know, it's 100 individuals. It's very easy to make a percentage out of it, because if 5 individuals out of 100 die, then the death rate is 5%, period. So let's see that 100 people or in our particular sample of the population, 70 of them would have to become immune, would have to have been exposed to the virus and survived. And when 70 of 100 humans have survived exposure to the coronavirus, we can say that those 100 people, that cluster of 100 people, have obtained herd immunity. Basically, it means functionally that it is highly unlikely that the other 30 people would get the virus, would be infected, because most likely the other 70 would be reinfected first, and because they're already immune, then that virus will essentially die in those immune people, and the virus will not be passed on. So the infectivity drops dramatically with herd immunity, okay? Now, how do we get that 70? What's so magic about the 70? There's no magic here. It's only the numbers. It has to do with the R0, or the R0 value, which is on the x-axis here, okay? Now, the R0 is an experimental value, and it means the number of people that are likely to be infected from one individual. And that has to come out of the data. That has to come out of the infectivity of each disease, of each virus. Each virus, let's say, has a different R value, R0. And there are many factors. This is the simplest case, which you can see is kind of unrealistic, because this assumes many things. This assumes homogeneity among the population, that everyone is about healthy, that everybody is about the same age, let's say, that no comorbidities, meaning no other illnesses in the population, etc. So this is the simplest case, right? And the R0 for this coronavirus, as measured early in Wuhan, is between 1.4 and 5.7. That's the range. That's the range, the R0 range in Wuhan early in 2020, 6 months ago. This is the infectivity rate. In other words, every individual was infecting anywhere from 1.4 other people to 1.7 other people. So the average is going to be between 3 and 4. You see, so the R0 for the coronavirus, for COVID-19, is between 3 and 4. And this number has been corroborated in other parts of the world as the epidemic became a pandemic, from Wuhan to other parts of China, but especially outside of China to other parts of the world, including the US. Okay, so if the R0 for COVID-19 is between 3 and 4, this curve, which is also an experimental curve, it demonstrates the herd immunity threshold, and the scale, the Y scale here, is again arbitrary, from 0 to 1, which can also be turned into a percentage, simply for convenience. We want to quantify the Y-axis. So by convention, arbitrarily, we choose a scale from 0 to 1 with 2 decimal places. This scale also means a percentage, from 0% to 100%, and that's why 2 decimal places. So when we go vertically on the R0 of about 3.5, and we hit the curve, which is a parabola described by the herd immunity threshold, and we go horizontally to the y-axis, we come up to about 0.70, or the 70%, right? The percentage of the population that needs to have achieved immunity in order to consider herd immunity, meaning that the rest of the population is unlikely to get infected. See, because of the parable, we're already in the threshold area of the parable. All right, now let's look at some numbers. Let's translate this 70% into the world population. First, this is the 70% of infected people, right? So first of all, we have to find out how many people, what percentage of the population is infected, and what percentage dies. All right, this comes from the Worldometer, which is measuring the death rate, the infection rate and the death rate of every country of the world for COVID-19. And here's the reference. You can punch it in and go to that site. It's a live site that is in dynamic activation periodically. So the number of death, the percentage of death, as of a couple of days ago, August 7, all right? Globally, this is for the whole world now. There were over 700,000 people dead from COVID-19. And infected, all right, infected were 19 million, over 19 million, closer to 20 million infected. Confirmed infected. This is also, we have to understand that this is confirmed infected, all right? If we do the simple math to convert this into a percentage, we take the number of dead divided by the number of infected to get a fraction, to get a decimal, and then multiply that by 100, and that gives us a percentage of death. What is the death rate of COVID-19 with the current numbers after 6 months of the pandemic? It's about 3.7%, right? But this 3.7% is actually an upper limit. We can say that is up to 3.7% because this number, now these two numbers are robust because they're in the hundreds of thousands or millions. So this is what we call in statistics a robust number. But of the two, the dead is more robust than the infected because the dead are definitely dead. Even though this number has some wiggle on the margins. Wiggle on the margins means that sometimes the patient died of a heart attack or the patient died of kidney failure. They had COVID-19, but that was a comorbidity. They died of something else, okay? But because they had COVID-19, then they're counted as the COVID-19 deaths. But they could have died from something else and just happened to have had the virus also. They did not die from respiratory failure, which is a typical death of COVID-19. All right, so this number is robust, but not 100% robust. This number, the number of infected, confirmed infected, is robust, but it's kind of an upper limit in the sense that, what about the ones who are infected and just haven't been tested, haven't been confirmed? We could estimate that maybe it's double this number. The ones that are infected, they have either a mild case or they are in the asymptomatic phase, which could be up to a week or two, right? Or they just think they have a flu. They just haven't been tested. So this number is a underestimate. It's an underestimate. It could be twice this number of the ones who are actually infected throughout the world. And if it's twice this number because it's in the denominator, then it will halve the fraction, even smaller. So instead of being almost 4, it could be around 2, less than 2%. Less than 2%, when we get into the 1 to 2%, we're approximating what would be a flu season, you know, a new flu strain that is going through the world. All right, and so this number is kind of an upper limit of the death for COVID-19, according to the numbers as of about 3 days ago. Okay, what are we going to do with this number? What's important about this number is a percentage. Now, the human population currently is about 7.8 billion people. And 70% of that is the ones who would need to be immunized by the exposure to the virus or the vaccine, all right, which I haven't talked about the vaccine yet. But we need to figure out what is 70% of the human population, which is this number of people is the number of people who need to have been infected and survived. In other words, this is the 96% of those to survive, because if 4% die, then 96% have survived, right? Which is another good news about this. 4% die from COVID-19, that means that 96% have lived after being exposed. And they have developed the antibodies. Then that the antibodies don't last is another story. It gets more complicated. But let's stay with a simple scenario for now. What is 70% of the world population is about 5.5 billion people. About 5.5 billion people need to have been exposed to the virus and survived, right? Now imagine that. Right now we are at 20 million people that have been exposed, confirmed. Let's say it's double that. That's 40 million. Let's say it's triple that. That's 60 million. Let's say it's 5 times that many because they haven't been tested. That's 100 million. 100 million to a billion, you know, we're still one order of magnitude away. So a very large percentage of the population, of the world population, would need to get infected and survive in order to reach herd immunity. That is, simply put, a very cruel scenario. Yet, to give you a bottom line here, in my opinion, that's where we're going to go sooner or later, because that's where we've gone with other infections throughout the world, except for the vaccine issue, which I'll talk about coming up. Okay, so if we take these people, this 5.5 billion people, the 70% who were infected by the virus, right, to reach the herd immunity, and we take the 3.7% of that, right? We take 3.7% of that to see how many would die from being infected. That gives us 200 million people, okay? 200 million people would die to reach herd immunity throughout the world. 200 million people at the rate of 3.7%, 3.7 deaths. All right. Now, if we take this, the final percentage that I want to do here is what is this 200 million dead? What does that represent to the world population? What percentage of the world population? Okay, because it's 3.7 of the 70%. But what is it of the whole world population? 200 million out of the whole world population comes to about 2.6% of the world population would have to die to reach herd immunity. Now, I make a little pause here in case someone wants to make a comment or ask a question or question any of the math. The arithmetic is just basic arithmetic here, doing percentages. All right? Questions, comments, nothing? All right, so basically achieving herd immunity, which is what the rest of nature does, is a very cruel thing, and it is called natural selection. On average, which are the ones who are not going to survive? On average, this 3.7% who are going to die are going to be the weaker ones, which for us translates into normally, naturally, typically, kind of 3 categories of people: the elderly, the young, the children, and those who for some reason are immunocompromised in the middle of life. In other words, that they have some illness or some deficiency in their immune system, okay? So in general, we will call those the weaker organisms, biologically speaking. On average, the weaker will not survive, on average. So we need to keep going back and forth here between a statistical model, a probabilistic model that talks about percentages and numbers, and a deterministic model, which is you and I, actual living human beings, because we're not a statistic, right? What does this do to me? To know that 3.7% of COVID-19 infected die, this is a number that we can only tell post factor, after looking back, okay? In other words, beforehand, I don't know if tomorrow I'm going to be on the 4% dead or on the 96% alive. I won't know until I go through tomorrow, and then the day after, and so forth. So that's why it's always a challenge. We lived in these two worlds simultaneously, the world of statistics and the world of real life human beings that we are. And we need to navigate back and forth, because this is informative. This tells me that this virus is very serious. I have to take it seriously. And if I get tired of washing my hands, too bad. If I get tired of using a mask, too bad. Because unless I do that, I could end up here. We have to take it seriously. It is severe and acute, right? All right, let's move forward. So COVID herd immunity would cause the humanity about 2.6 death rate, the world population. To put it in perspective, for HIV/AIDS, for example, at the height of the pandemic, which was around 2010, it was 36 million. 36 million who died from HIV/AIDS before the cocktails came out. And at that time, the human population was about 7 billion. So if we do that math, it's about 0.5%, less than, it's 0.5% of the world population died from AIDS back in the AIDS pandemic, about 10 years ago. That puts it in perspective. More closer to this number, to the 2.6, is the flu pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, which is a misnomer because it was only Spain that was reporting. It was mostly Spain that was reporting the casualties because they stayed neutral in the First World War, and they were reporting more death casualties. But other countries were suppressing information because of the wars that were going on, the First World War, okay? And so it's estimated anywhere between 20 to 50 million people died from that Spanish flu, which actually hit Switzerland more than Spain. But at that time, the population of the world was just under 2 billion. And therefore, when we do that math, it is a rate between 1.1 and 2.8% of the world population died from the Spanish flu, okay? Between 1.1 and 2.8%, depending on where we are here, died from the Spanish flu about 100 years ago. And those numbers are equivalent percentage-wise, even though today we have about 5 times more of the world population, or at least, 4 times the world population. All right, 4 times more. All right, so let's look at vaccines then, because what would vaccine do? It would kind of preempt this curve in the sense that it would allow us to reach herd immunity without having to expose 70% of the population to the actual virus. What the vaccine does, it exposes the population to either a killed virus or destroyed, because they're not really living viruses, or an attenuated virus, okay? It means that on average, the people who get the vaccine are not supposed to get the disease. What the vaccine is supposed to do is stimulate the immune system to kill that destroyed or attenuated virus or fragmented virus, you see, to build up the immune system without actually getting the disease. But there's the efficiency of the vaccine, of the effectiveness, all right? Now, we don't have an analog for COVID-19 because it's novel, but we have an analog for the flu vaccine. And since this is a flu-like disease, right, being a retrovirus and all that, then this is a good guidepost for us. The effectiveness, what is known as the VE, the vaccine effectiveness of flu, is between 40 and 60%. So about half is about 50% effective, right? 50%, meaning that about half of the people who get the flu vaccine being exposed to the flu will not get the flu, and the other half will get the flu. So that's a guidepost. That means that at the end of the day, after all the effort of the 200 plus different labs of the world that are working on a COVID vaccine, that may only be 50% effective. All right, let's talk about the vaccine, and then I'm going to drop the vaccine issue, because it represents, again, think of it from the bioethical perspective. of the human behavior involved here, all right? Beyond, you got to be competent on the biology of it and all that, but now we got to bump it up to the bioethical level of the bioethical analysis, right? How soon? And these are open questions, right? How soon will that vaccine come out before nature takes us to herd immunity inexorably? Because that's what it's doing now. Again, we go back to these numbers. You know, right now, the 94% of the people who have survived have been, in fact, approximating, you know, they're pushing toward herd immunity. They're still over here. But what I'm trying to say is that nature will not stop and wait. It's not going to take a break and say, okay, the virus, I'm going to stop now until these humans figure out the vaccine for me. It's like on weekends. You know, on weekends, you go to a hospital, good luck. Don't get sick on a Friday afternoon, because on the weekends, it's a skeleton crew. I'm talking on the normal circumstances. Now, the hospital, forget it, but even on the normal circumstances. You get sick on a Friday afternoon and go to the hospital on the weekend, it's a skeleton crew. No one's going to give you any aggressive treatment unless it's an emergency situation. You got to wait until Monday. Monday morning, 7 a.m., 8 a.m., when the new staff kicks in, all right? But in the meantime, the bacteria, the virus, whatever I have, didn't stop on the weekend, didn't go on a break, continues, because nature doesn't stop. Nature doesn't stop. Nature cannot stop. There's a little saying, God always forgives. If there's repentance, God forgives. Man, human, sometimes forgive. We forgive sometimes, and sometimes we don't forgive. Nature never forgives, because nature cannot forgive. Nature is mindless. Nature doesn't have a conscience. Nature keeps moving inexorably forward with natural selection, which is what causes speciation, or may cause speciation. And that's why we have, you know, the estimated 10 to 20 million species on Earth. About 2 million have been classified. But biodiversity comes from natural selection, all right? And we are not immune to natural selection because we're part of nature. Human nature is part of nature. So how soon will that vaccine come, or those vaccines? How effective will it be? Who gets it? How will it be distributed? Who determines the most vulnerable populations? Who determines that, or how to determine that? Who pays for this? Millions and millions of dollars are going into this already, with the prospect of making millions on it, right? Is it going to be sold? At what price? 50 cents, $50? It's saving people's life. How much would you pay for saving your life? So what if the virus mutates? It's a retrovirus, single-stranded RNA, much more susceptible to mutation than DNA. It's unstable. And so there already have been several mutations. It is said that the original virus that came out of Wuhan has mutated, and the virus that finally went eventually through Italy and Spain and then crossed the Atlantic into New York and the rest of the US is already a mutant that is more virulent than the original virus that appeared in Wuhan, 6 months ago. And so what happens to a vaccine that was done on this strain, on this particular sequence, when that creature mutates again? And is it going to cause social unrest, more unrest? Is this going to divide or unite ethnicities and nations? Very open questions. They all have to do with bioethics, and you can reflect on them, all right? But we need to move forward. And we need to look a little more in the specifics of the pandemic. Stop for a moment. Questions, comments? I'm giving you quite a bit of information as we go along and things to think about, all right? And I'm going to give you more. So here we go. Let's look at the actual pandemic. There's no doubt that it started in China, and then it spread mostly through Europe. Italy got hit, then Spain. And originally there was a horizontal movement across the Northern Hemisphere, jumped, not only from the Atlantic, but also from the Pacific into the East Coast of the United States, Northeast, New York, Kennedy Airport, and California, LA, and other cities on the West Coast, Seattle, a large Asian community in the West Coast, the real West Coast of the US, all right? Not talking about Marco Island or Tampa Bay. But this map really is deceptive, because it's a geographical map. And so here's China. What if China were a tiny country, like for example, Korea, all right? Then it would show dark blue, but very small. In other words, this is geographic, showing all of China. This is showing all of the United States, but in fact, it's not homogeneous. That's what I'm saying. These are simplistic maps, and that's why we need to think. We need to spend some more ATPs on this. It's not homogeneous. There was an epicenter in New York. Now we're the epicenter down here. It's called an inhomogeneous distribution, right? And so we need to dig in. We need to delve in. Here is China more deeply, and this map is also informative. This is what I'm trying to say. Here is China. You can see the same contour, all right? And kind of like a broad Y, if you will, or a V shape. Here is the Henan region where Wuhan is, city of Wuhan, in dark blue. So let's scale it up for a moment. And you can see your scale here. Number of cases confirmed. Starting from 1 to 10 in these western regions. Then from 10 to 100, see, so these are orders of magnitude, 10 to 100. Darker blue, northern regions, the northern swath. Getting closer to the epicenter, which is this Hubei region here. Okay, not Henan, I'm sorry, Hubei. 500 to 1,000, the boundary, southern boundary. And then from 1,000 to almost 6,000 is the Hubei region. Now I can go here so I don't get out of the slide. Okay, you can barely see it, but this region here, this is called the Hubei region, all right? Let me zoom back out. Keep that in mind, that's informative because that's where the city of Wuhan is. And going back to the full slides. Sorry about that. Slow computer, all right. So, I'm building a case here for seeing how China shut down, locked down very fast, very soon, between December and January. But they locked down internally, however, not externally, meaning international flights, okay? Dramatic. I have a little video here to show you. Actually, it's a composite slide. Let me show you this for a moment. You will see from aerial photographs, satellite imaging, of how fast China shut down. Now what we have is nitrogen dioxide being measured. Nitrogen dioxide is a byproduct of fossil fuel burning. Fossil fuel burning, mostly from cars, in other words, a combustion engine, cars, but also other airplanes, for example, other machinery, okay? So here's China, that V shape. Here's the central China region. Here's Beijing, for example, all right? Move this, there you go. is Beijing, northern China. And the Hubei region is south of Beijing, and Wuhan city is within that Hubei region, more or less in this region here, this area. So this is the scale that goes from December to January, February, March, and it is measuring the amount of nitrogen dioxide, NO2, in the atmosphere by satellite imaging, all right? Here is December, you see, this is December. We know that China is one of the major contributors of greenhouse gases in the world. And so that's the measurement there. Now we scroll this across to the other side. Look at this. We pan horizontally. This is now mid-January. You see here, mid-January, satellite imaging, gone. Nitrogen dioxide, no combustion, shut down. This is what happens. This is what a centralized government can do, right? A single party centralized government tells the people, you're going to stay home and you're going to stay home. And we shut down the country. We shut down transportation internally. Before January, end of December, mid-January, 2 weeks later, China transportation basically shut down. All right, what's my point with all this? My point with all this is that China shut down internally very fast. Everybody went into lockdown. However, they maintained, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get the slide a little larger. There we go. They maintain international travel and continued, and that's why we get these two opposing curves. You can call this the scissor tails, the scissor curves. They drop dramatically after this line comes down to February 13 here, mid-February was their peak, mid-February, 4,000 cases, all right? And then it dropped dramatically, plummeted the number of confirmed cases. In contrast, here's the rest of the world, cumulative. Cumulatively, the lag phase, the typical sigmoid curve, growth curve, right? Lag phase, then it goes to a log phase, exponential, and who knows when this is going to curve back into a plateau. It seems like maybe here, but we don't know the next point. All right, this is July. So, but we can see this curve describing the first half of a sigmoid growth curve, lag and then log, diametrically opposed to the curve in China, where after their most dramatic cases in beginning of February, the first half of February, it plummeted because they essentially closed down the country internally. However, why was it not done externally? This is what I'm talking about. Let's go here to the next slide. This is what I'm talking about. Here's a news report from, this is from, I think it's The Guardian, which is a British newspaper. I have the reference up here. Yes, The Guardian is a British newspaper. Coronavirus death hits 259 as China voices anger at US travel ban. Sometimes we have short memory. I don't know if you people remember any longer. So much has happened since January and February. But at the end of January, when the virus was spreading outside of China into Europe, Remember first Italy, precisely Milan, there's a big fashion explosion of Chinese articles and a lot of trade between Italy, northern Italy and China, and then Spain. Our focus was there in Europe, all right? The current president shut down travel from Spain, from China into the US. China has reacted angrily to a US entry ban on foreign nationals who have visited the country in the past 2 weeks, as countries around the world race to contain the coronavirus outbreak amid a rising death toll. This is dated February 1st, in the Guardian newspaper, prestigious newspaper of Great Britain. All right, so in other words, China is upset that other countries of the world are imposing traveling bans on the Chinese, flights in and out, but themselves, they shut down the country. What's going on, right? Okay, let's move forward. Here we go. 430,000 people have traveled from China to the US since the coronavirus surfaced, right? Now notice this was published in April 4 and then updated on April 15. This is from the New York Times. The New York Times. It says, Chinese officials disclosed the outbreak of a mysterious flu-like illness to international health officials on New Year's Eve, right? New Year's Eve. Since then, at least 130,000 people have arrived into the United States on direct flights from China, including 40,000 in the 2 months after President Trump imposed restrictions of travel. So why did China continue to allow its nationals, its Chinese infected people to get out of China and to go to other countries if their own country shut down? That's a bioethical question of immense proportions because it involves human lives, all right? And the data was collected on both countries. So here's a report in April 15 that flights were still going on out of China, 3 months, 4 months into the pandemic. All right. So let me make a little stop here. Questions, comments? The open question is, why did China shut down its own country and allowed international travel to continue for weeks and months of their own people and of foreigners coming into China? All right. Let's look at the source, the very source. Because I've mentioned Wuhan several times, so everybody knows now that this is the city where the epicenter lies of the start of the coronavirus. No one negates that. And in fact, they are blaming bats for the origin of the what is known as zoonotic transfer, meaning a transfer of the virus from an animal into a human, okay? Now, this is nothing new. It's happened before in human history. We should know better. For example, HIV in the human immunodeficient virus came from a chimp, simian immunodeficient virus, right? From chimp. In the 1920s, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DNR, where these nationals were hunting and eating chimpanzee, and trading, obviously in the black market because they are protected by law, maybe not back then, but since then, this continues with poaching, illegal poaching and all that. Again, bioethical issues, right? So simian immunodeficient virus jumped into the human and caused a pandemic back at the beginning of last century. Of this century. All right, so possible bat origin of the SARS-CoV-2. This is from the CDC, published just last month. An article in their website. So let's look at these bats, possible bat origin. So these are the wet markets. These are the wet markets in Asia in general. They're very popular in Asia, other countries of the world also, Africa, etc. But particularly in Asia, you'll see why they're called wet for a moment. But here you see the bats on sale, right? Roasted bats, which is wildlife. And there's a lot of wildlife that is sold on these wet markets. For example, look at this photograph. This is just from the web. This is what I mean by lateral verification or corroboration. This is one of those wet markets. You can see, obviously, this is meat of all kinds, right? Doesn't look much refrigeration here. I mean, look at this fellow. He's not exactly dressed with heavy clothing because it's very cold in here because they're keeping all of this meat that is exposed to the horizon refrigerated. This is a tropical environment, all right? So this is part of the wet markets. There's another part of these wet markets. Look at this fellow. So here you see the actual skinned animals hanging there for sale, okay? Some of them you can tell from the anatomy what it is. This fellow is wearing boots because he's on a mud puddle. This other lady seems to be trying to avoid the mud puddle. So that's part of the reason why they call it wet markets. Look at this report from the Time magazine in January of 2020, Time magazine. Ultimately, experts say that it's hard to downplay the problematic nature of wet markets. They are named so because of the large quantities of water used to slosh the floors. That's how these markets are cleaned, in quotations, with water. And that water is especially so because they sell live animals. And it's a mixture of urine and feces and other bodily fluids from live wild creatures end up mixing with the blood from butchered animals, providing ideal opportunities for viruses and bacteria to thrive. Time magazine in January of this year. Wet markets. So let's go to the wet market. Here it is. The epicenter in the city of Wuhan has been pretty much pointed to this market here, the Wuhan, Huanan, Haixian, Pifa, Xishan market. Here we see an emergency vehicle actually leaving the market. Everything is barricaded, all right? When we punch this name into Google to see what this is, again, the lateral verification, from coming sideways into the issue. Here is my search. You can punch this in. Here is the Wuhan, Huanan, Haixian, Pifa, Xishan market. All right, it's a wholesale market. You can read about it. I went into this site from Time Magazine, and that's where I pulled out this quote. Okay, this quote comes from this source down here. But what I want to point out is that already this market is on the radar for being the epicenter or one of the epicenters because of the wildlife that is sold here, either butchered or live. And even though it's illegal, it's going on. It's going on. So my point with this is the following. Here in the United States, we eat wildlife. It's sold. Wildlife is also sold in the United States, okay? It's not that it's not sold. Here's a bison steak, otherwise known as buffalo. It's very lean meat, about 99% lean, so it's very good, very low in cholesterol and so forth. In fact, and they sold. You can buy one for about $18.95, one steak of buffalo meat in the United States legally. And alligator in Florida is sold, right? Again, low fat content, it's high in protein. And sushi, I don't know if you like sushi, I love sushi, it's raw fish and other seafood, salmon, eggs, etc., raw. So we buy and sell wildlife, even raw wildlife, in the United States. What's the big difference? The big difference is that it's regulated. It's regulated against human behavior. These farms have to pass through all kind of scrutiny and government regulation, yes, FDA, Food and Drug Administration, scrutiny, in order to put this on the market. And so when we eat it, we don't get sick, right? Because regulation, and regulation that is enforced, human behavior, right? In Wuhan and in China, they have regulation. But the question remains, is it enforced? Because the wet markets, sorry. They look like this, okay? Another possible source, though I haven't heard this in the news, maybe traditional Chinese medicine, because it's known for centuries, maybe millennia. Traditional Chinese medicine is an apothecary that is not associated with what we know as modern medicine, where portions are tested first, including all the way up to clinical trials and so forth, and regulated again by the Food and Drug Administration and other agencies. No, these are potions and powders that are ground up. And it's not just plant material, it's also animal material. You can see dried up snakes here, other animal materials here. Definitely this skull is not a plant, right? You see open up lizards here, and even mammals, heads, hoofs. This is all part of Chinese traditional medicine, right? Which is also sold in these markets, in the West markets. There's no distinction. These are products that are sold and bought in the wet markets also. So it could have been a jump from a zoonotic jump from one of these potions. I don't know, I haven't seen it on the news, but I'm just saying as another possibility of the jump, the zoonotic jump. Now, let me delve a little bit more about Wuhan, because it turns out that Wuhan actually has 11 million people. 11 million people. This is not a little town in rural China, somewhere up in the mountains that is disconnected from the rest of civilization. These are photos of Wuhan. These are photographs of Wuhan, okay? Skyscrapers, 11 million people. It's actually one of the 45 megalopolis of the world. A megalopoly is a city that has more than 10 million people living in it. China population as a whole, 1.4 billion, is about 1/5 of the world's population. So we're not talking about an underdeveloped country that is poor and struggling. No, we're talking about a superpower. This is the second largest economy in the world. The first is the United States. This is the second largest economy of the world. They shut down early, internally. And externally, flights going on, and they complain. The regime, the communist regime, complained, was angry that other governments of the world were imposing travel bans on them. Another little slide I had here were just Nobel Prize winners from China, okay? Nobel laureates, they have plenty, many of them in science. So this is not some backward, underdeveloped country. This is a world power. Why did China lock down internally but not externally? Interest. What interest? Political interest, economic interest, social, scientific interest? Maybe all of the above. Okay, another break moment. Any questions, comments? Okay, let's get a little more into it. See, I'm raising questions because, again, you need to own your education, right? We need to own our education. I need to go out of my house as much as you need to go out of your house. In fact, I'm going out of my house more now coming up in the fall semester because as faculty, we're all expected to be in the classroom teaching to whoever shows up. But you have the option to either show up face-to-face or remain virtual, all right? And so we need to know what's going on and what's going to go on further forward as we go from days into weeks and weeks into months and years. All right. Let's look at a question that is another bioethical question. Was the virus engineered? The background of the labs, you have to know about the 4-level labs, the BSL, biosafety level. BSL is the acronym for biosafety level labs. Excuse me, they go from 1 to 4. They're also known as P labs, P1 through 4. P for pathogen or protection, either one, all right? And so here is just a table where it shows you the levels of containment. To give you an example, BSL-1 labs, P1 labs are, they deal with animals and plants and bacteria that are generally don't pose a significant health threat, all right, to individuals, to the average individual. So we don't need many special equipment. We'll use gloves for protection and so forth. But we have P1 labs at St. Thomas University, and many universities have P1 labs, okay? Then it goes to 2 when there is some level of containment, right? There's a moderate risk. Then BSL 3 and 4 are high containment and maximum containment with P4 labs. Then you can see sample organisms for P1 E. coli, for P2, up until now, influenza and even HIV is just a P2 lab. But moving further to more contagious diseases like tuberculosis or Ebola, P3 or P4, all right? Okay, so you can read more details about the scale and the table, but I want to concentrate on P3 and P4 labs, which are containment labs. Nothing is supposed to get out of these labs, right? Okay. So there is that conspiracy theory going around that, what about the Wuhan lab? It turns out that there is a now P4 lab in the city of Wuhan. Let me introduce to you Wuhan Institution of Virology, otherwise known as WICAS. The CAS stands for the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The Wuhan Institute of Virology is part of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, all right? Here's a photograph of that lab, and it's a high containment lab. It started many years ago, but it bumped up to a P3 lab in 2012 and to a P4 lab in 2018. It is the largest lab in Asia to contain viral strains. 1,500 viral strains are housed and studied and banked in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, okay? So where is this Wuhan Institute of Virology? Hello, dear students, my apologies, but the end of the previous video, something happened that got mixed up. So I'm re-recording the last part of this video and just splicing it in. So there will be a splice into this section that you're listening now. I had left off at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, showing you that this is the largest viral collection in a lab in Asia, housing 1,500 different strains of viruses. And that it started as a P3 lab in 2012, and it went to a P4 lab in 2018, okay? Now, I want to show you a couple of publications which are significant with regards to the engineering. Remember the question here, the bioethical question is, was the virus engineered? And I'll tell you the bottom line conclusion is that there was a coronavirus that was engineered in this lab, and these are the publications. So first, we go to 2005 in the journal Science. As you can see here, bats are natural reservoirs for SARS-like coronaviruses. Now, these authors are from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This is a publication from that lab, and they are researching coronaviruses, and they have come to the conclusion that bats in China are carrying the SARS-like coronavirus. So that was in 2005. Then in 2015, that lab puts out this publication, SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence, right? I'll tell you what this is from Nature's own words. This is in Nature Medicine. And essentially, this is in 2015, in November of 2015, what this Wuhan lab did is this. In Nature's own news publication, as you can see up here, Nature news publication, engineered bat virus stirs debate over risky research. Lab-made coronavirus related to SARS can infect human cells. An experiment that created a hybrid version of a bat coronavirus, one related to the virus that causes SARS, has triggered renewed debate over whether engineering lab variants of viruses with possible pandemic potential is worth the risk. This was published in 2015 in Nature journal. An article published in Nature Medicine, November 9, is the article that I just showed you. Scientists investigated a virus called Shock14, which is found in horseshoe bats, the horseshoe bats in China that are the carriers of the coronavirus. The researchers created a chimeric version made up of a surface protein of Shock14 and the backbone of a SARS virus that had been adapted to grow in mice and to mimic human disease. So they're using mice as a model, as a mammalian model. The chimera infected human airway cells. The chimera infected human airway cells in the lab, proving that the surface protein of Shock14 has the necessary structure to bind to a key receptor. We know that this key receptor is now ACE2, the key receptor on the cells and to infect them, lung cells with ACE2 receptors. It also caused disease in mice, but did not kill them. So here we have in 2015 already, 5 years ago, that this Wuhan lab had already engineered a chimeric virus using the SARS coronavirus from bat and enabling the surface proteins with Shock14 to bind to human receptors. These surface proteins are precisely on the spikes, on the crown, on the corona of the coronavirus. The spikes that are the ones that do the engagement with the cell membrane of human cells, lung cells, for injecting the RNA, okay? So it's not a question whether the virus was engineered or not. There is publication in Nature that a virus was indeed engineered and was capable of infecting human cells, and the danger of a pandemic was already raised back 5 years ago. Possible pandemic potential. So here's an air view of the Wuhan lab. Here are some aerial photographs of the lab itself from the outside. This is the inside, one shot of the inside of the lab. You can see definitely positive pressure suits, Nothing is supposed to come out of a P4 lab because this is the highest level of containment that we have in the world for these labs. Where is this Wuhan lab? Here's the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Here's the lab, okay? And here is the seafood market, which was the epicenter of the pandemic. As you can see from the map here, the distance by road is about 21 kilometers, about 13 miles. This river here, this is the Yangtze River, very famous river in China. In other words, this P4 lab is embedded in this city of Wuhan, which has 11 million people. A megalopoly of 11 million people with a P4 lab in it, okay? It may be coincidence that this lab already had for 5 years an engineered SARS coronaviruses capable of infecting humans, and that the epicenter was 13 miles away at a wet market on the same megalopoly. Now, a little further, I want to go to these two sites for a moment so that we understand, and this is what I call lateral collaboration or corroboration, lateral corroboration. Here is a site, the official site of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This is from the Chinese Academy of Science. Remember I mentioned CAS, with CAS, okay, the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This is their official website. And you can see that they are highlighting the Wuhan lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There it is, you can see the photos. And it has a little description of what's going on in this lab, all right? And they're very proud of it. At the end, look at the last sentence of this first paragraph. At the same time, it can also effectively improve China's capability in preventing and responding to biological wars and terrorist attacks and ensure biosafety in China. So certainly it is within the purview of this lab to consider biological warfare and terrorist attacks. Okay. However, the other little site that I have from the presentation here, this other site, this is from the United Nations, going back to 1972. Look at this. This is the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, Biological Weapons, the Biological Weapons Convention, the first international convention at the UN on biological warfare. This convention on the prohibition of the development, production, and stockpiling of bacteriological and toxic weapons and on their destruction. This was in 1972, April of 1972. And this is for the signatories, the member states of the UN, including China. So back in the 70s already, there were international treaties and conventions prohibiting the development, production, and stockpiling of bacteriological weapons. Okay? So you draw your own conclusions. Therefore, it's not a question of whether the virus was engineered or not. The virus was engineered, and it was in that lab for 5 years. Now, how it got out, if we got out intentionally or unintentionally, we may never know. But in the best case scenario, it was an accident. Why did China lock down in January? And in April, there were still flights coming out of China, contaminating and infecting the rest of the world and generating a truly global pandemic. In the worst case scenario, it was actually engineered, and who knows if it was also being tested for biological warfare. Perhaps we will never know, but these are definitely bioethical questions. And how do we do the confirmation of this? Well, what I'm calling lateral confirmation. Not directly, because if you ask, anyone is going to say, no, of course not. But then some of the evidence leaves a lot to wonder. Finally, I want to end with this. You know, at St. Thomas University, we seek to train leaders for life. Our students are encouraged to become leaders for life. Our mission is a Catholic university with rich cultural and international diversity. We certainly have diversity at St. Thomas University, on the student population, on the faculty, the administration, committed to the academic and professional success of its students who become ethical leaders in our global community. So my friends, this is the challenge that I present to you today as you are coming into the adult world. This adult world that in several ways we have messed up for you, the previous generations. Again, I mentioned last century with not one but 2 world wars, 2 nuclear bombs dropped on civilian population. And in this century, a pandemic of a virus, a novel virus, that in the best case scenario was spread throughout the world by actions that leave a lot to think about. And in the worst case scenario was actually engineered in a P4 lab. That's why I say, and I started the presentation, you no longer can afford not to think, all right? My invitation is for you to have your minds on and to analyze and examine critically all the information that you're receiving and search the information yourself, because there's a wealth of information online and we have to discern through the information what is right, what is wrong, what is true, and what is false. To be critical about what is being told us and to try to verify and confirm. And the very last slide that I do have for you is that because of the increasing complexity of all these bioethical issues over the years, finally, 4 years ago, I launched a new degree at St. Thomas University, a Master of Science in Bioethics. So I invite you to consider, after your bachelor's, to do a Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. We touch upon all of the bioethical issues in contemporary society. If you're interested in this program, you want to know more about it, you can send me an email to my STU address. Send me an email and I'll be very happy to send you more information about this Master of Science in Bioethics. Once again, thank you very much for listening, for participating, and certainly I wish you all the best in your studies. Own your education and you will be doing great. Bye-bye now.